Disarmament Part 3. Worldwide disarmament would mean bloody anarchy or world dictatorship. Hence, Western nations must maintain all weaponry necessary to protect their civilization. Any disarmament proposal is dangerous. Yet, in the interest of negotiating for disarmament, Eisenhower and Kennedy prohibited American testing of nuclear weapons for more than 3 years, giving the Soviets a lead in developing weaponry which may mean control of the earth. Kennedy forces rammed the Disarmament Agency Act through Congress and proposed a treaty to surrender American nuclear weapons to the United Nations. In 1962, the Disarmament Agency made more proposals for American surrender. In 1963, the Soviets demanded another moratorium on testing, and Kennedy gave it to them. That is a summary of my report on Disarmament Part 3. The full report after a message from my sponsor. 1917, international communists began to use worldwide disarmament propaganda as a means of taking all weapons away from non-communists so that they can offer no resistance to communism. Lenin said, and Khrushchev has repeated, that communists are contemptuous of pacifism, but can effectively use pacifists in non-communist nations. Pacifists believe that war is horrible, and every decent and sane person on earth agrees with them. Pacifists, however, are not willing to accept reality. Reality is that wars are inevitable until human beings are better than they have ever been before. Human beings cannot be improved by legislation or disarmament pacts or by having their weapons taken away from them. Suppose non-communist nations could make an agreement with communist dictators which resulted in the actual worldwide elimination of all modern weapons of war. What would then prevent the hordes of Asia and Africa from overrunning the civilized world with butcher knives? To avoid such a catastrophe, why not disarm all nations, but at the same time arm an international agency to keep the peace? This would be worse than total disarmament without an armed authority to enforce order. Any agency with enough authority to police the world and with a monopoly of modern weapons will enslave and oppress the world. That fact also derives from the nature of man. Civilized people stripped of weapons would at least have a better chance to defend themselves against lawless and ravaging hordes than to defend themselves against an international authority armed with modern weapons and in control of the world. Men will become good enough to refrain from warring on each other only when and if all men accept for themselves the saving grace that God offers. Meanwhile, it behooves all nations, most especially civilized Western nations whose culture is founded on faith in God, to maintain whatever weaponry is necessary to protect their civilization against all threats within or without. The testing of nuclear explosions is necessary for research to develop nuclear weapons. Each nuclear explosion produces a mass of new information which is useless until it has been carefully evaluated. The work of evaluation after a series of tests may take years. During that time, it is not sensible to do any major testing. In 1958, the Soviets, having concluded a major series of nuclear tests, asked for a moratorium on testing. President Eisenhower halted all American testing, accepting Khrushchev's promise that he would do likewise. Kennedy continued the ban on American testing, though it was universally known that the Soviets had never kept their word. The men whom Kennedy placed in charge of defense and disarmament policies were on record as wanting American disarmament, with or without Soviet disarmament. They devised a defense program admittedly intended to please the Soviets. They rammed through Congress an act creating a disarmament agency with a director empowered to do anything which he might claim to be in the interest of peace and disarmament. And they submitted to the UN a proposed treaty which would disarm the United States and surrender her nuclear weapons. By the end of 1961, military men were expressing grave fear that the Kennedy defense and disarmament programs would leave the United States helpless against the Soviets. On March 2, 1962, President Kennedy admitted that Soviet testing, in the absence of American testing, had produced grave danger for the whole free world. The Soviet tests had given them information for weaponry development beyond anything known to the United States. The President indicated that the Soviets may be near the goal of developing the most desperately needed weapon of this century, a defense against enemy rockets, and that the United States had no hope of developing such a weapon without extensive nuclear testing. It was therefore reasonable to assume that the President would order massive American nuclear testing. He did not. He ordered a new series of tests beginning in late April 1962, but promised that the tests would not be conducted if the Soviets would sign a nuclear test ban by mid-April. The Soviets did not comply, and a series of American nuclear testing began on April 26, 1962, the first in more than 3 years. But the testing was hobbled by politics and propaganda, and Kennedy called it off after only a few shots had been made. In August 1962, President Kennedy startled the world by reversing the American stand on the question of inspection and control. Consistently, American officials had insisted that disarmament would not work unless enforced by an international inspection and control system. Khrushchev had insisted that existing national inspection systems would be all right. In April 1962, President Kennedy had rejected Khrushchev's proposal for an unpoliced moratorium on underground nuclear testing for the specific reason that there is no positive means of telling whether an earth tremor is caused by earthquake or by underground explosion. On August 1, 1962, President Kennedy announced that, whereas in April he had not believed there was adequate seismic instrumentation for identifying earth tremors, he now believed there was, and that he was therefore willing to abandon the previous American demand for an international inspection and control system. The President said he is now willing to accept the Khrushchev proposal for a national system under international supervision. The President laid down one proviso. The Soviets must accept the American principle of on-site inspections. This means that if detection equipment records an earth tremor which cannot be identified as an earthquake, international inspectors should be permitted to go to the locale of that tremor within the Soviet Union or elsewhere and make an on-the-spot, on-site inspection. In all, the United States Disarmament Agency drew up 4 different treaty proposals which were submitted to the Geneva Disarmament Conference in 1962. One was an elaboration of the disarmament proposal which Kennedy had submitted to the UN in 1961. It would strip the United States of nuclear and other modern weapons and provide for the destruction or surrender to the UN of all American combat aircraft, ships, missiles, tanks, anti-missile systems, and so on. Another U.S. Disarmament Agency proposal made in 1962 would give an international commission complete control over all nuclear materials and research, and the International Commission proposed, under the recommendations made by the U.S. Disarmament Agency, would be dominated by the Soviets. The Pugwash Conference in September 1962 proposed that detection of nuclear explosions might be achieved by unmanned nuclear detection stations, little black boxes. Pugwash Conference refers to meetings of Soviet and Western scientists under the auspices of Cyrus Eaton, an American industrialist whose sympathy with the Soviet Union is notorious. No stations of the kind suggested have yet been developed. If developed, they would be small, sealed boxes containing seismic equipment. A number of them would be placed throughout the world. If other detection equipment recorded an unidentifiable earth tremor located, say, on Soviet soil, the United States could request that international inspectors examine the seismic boxes located in the Soviet Union to see what they had recorded. The Soviets would then fly the boxes to some place and let international inspectors examine them. Now, that is the little black boxes scheme devised by Cyrus Eaton's pro-Soviet Pugwash Conference at London in September 1962. The Soviets, of course, adopted the Pugwash proposal as their own, suggesting